to End Times Prophecy News Update. This is Carrie Geren Scoggins. Tackling the subject of who's to blame for the wrong side of history, the slave trade. Remembering those such as Obama and other top Democrats accusing the Christians and the Bible, stating that they were the cause of the slave trade in the United States. And upon further investigation, we find it was Islamic originated. That Sharia law, that of Islam, supports the legalization of human slavery. The slave trade going all the way back before the Ottoman Empire, when Islam came in and took over that Roman sect. Constantinople, which became known as Istanbul. The Ottoman Empire, bringing in African slaves. According to Sharia, any non-Muslim can be taken as a slave for life, and their offspring also held as slaves, using them as slaves, as breeders, as sex slaves, and in the various forms and acts of slavery. Shackled and chained, some of the men castrated, a complete castration, not that which we in America think of. Complete removal. How does this fare with our Western Christian values? Is it a Christian value for the Democratic Party to want revisionist history in our textbooks, to then blame the Christians? Bringing up that the slaves were brought over on the good ship Jesus, just not mentioning it was the Islamic Jesus? Remembering that Islam has a version of Jesus Christ as only a prophet that is totally opposite of the Jesus that we find of the King James Bible. The good ship Jesus was not owned by Christian slave traders. It was owned by Islamic slave traders, yet used as a propaganda tool, brought up many times by Democrats and Christian haters on the left to feel they've discredited Christianity and the Bible. Religious bigotry at its root. Yet, when confronted with the truth, still refuse to note it was Islam running the slave trade, and when brought up that still to this day, over 25 million African slaves sold on the block naked, chained, in Islamic countries as we speak. Over 25 million African slaves still sold on the block naked in Islamic nations currently. As the photo meme says, no liberal ever complained about that. We don't see an outcry in the liberal Democrat media. Quite the contrary. Just as you see the vast ignorance in Europe. When someone speaks against Islam, they're falsely accused of racism. As if Islam is about race. The only race issue in Islam is their racism. Known in Saudi Arabia to this day, a black African cannot hold an office. Again, sold on this block as slaves in chains, naked. So I put to you the question, who is telling the truth? Who's on the right side of history? Will the American public ever know? Or will they continue to allow the Democrat teachers' unions to get in there and push revisionist history, stirring up hate towards the Christians, teaching false information, teaching small glimmers of the truth, so small that they go unnoticed, but making sure that it's heard that Christians own slaves? What is historically accurate? That Islam ran the slave trade. The good ship Jesus was owned by Islamic slave traders, and that still today they sell Africans as slaves to their own people. Sharing a clip of a 1960s video where wealthy Islamic oil tycoons buy black slaves for their children's birthday.
Kuwait, with a population of scarcely 300,000, takes in close to $3 million a day in oil royalties. Not that these millions are allowed to trickle down, but to raise the standard of living of the people, of the Fellahin or the Bedouins. Instead, oil has brought in its wake a new biblical curse. It has raised the price of human flesh. Storage tanks and pipelines add a new and modern decorative touch to the vast emptiness of the desert. But they provide no sustenance for the people who live nearby, in hunger and misery and desperation. Water is precious, and the camel is precious. And to give the camel a rest now and then, water is drawn by slaves. These girls, 10 to 12 years old, are blindfolded to keep from getting dizzy as they take turns with a camel. The most modern equipment available is used to extract oil from thousands of feet below the surface of the earth. But water must be drawn by the effort of human slaves. For luckier children, there are model schools inside the palaces. The pupils pray before lessons begin. We are permitted to film the pupils as they come out of the royal school. More than 100, we are told, are children of the sovereign himself. Following them are the children of the princes and high dignitaries. They're clean, well-disciplined, happy children. But note that some of them do not carry books. These are children of the oil rich. Their books are carried by their personal slaves. Slaves received as gifts from their parents on their birthdays. Slaves who will grow up alongside their masters and serve as their personal gods. Most of these are children of palace slaves, and according to the law, they too are slaves. The oil millions turn into automobiles from Detroit, parking lots, and traffic cops who direct traffic straight toward the desert. We travel along the edge of the Sahara to reach the Peuls, a pastoral people once numerous and powerful, now reduced to a few thousand by mass raids of slave merchants early in this century. They no longer have any cattle of their own. The great herds they lead to pasture are owned by Arab merchants.
And video clips of current complaints on continued slavery, even in areas, Islamic nations that claim to have banned slavery, and it's just overlooked, yet running rampant.
Les chaînes, c'est pour les captifs. Les chaînes, c'est pour l'esclave qui vient de devenir esclave. Mais l'esclave descendant de plusieurs générations, il est esclave même dans sa tête. Et il est totalement soumis. Et c'est malheureusement ce genre d'esclavage que nous avons aujourd'hui. Celui dont rêvait le planteur américain.
There's one place in the world where slavery is still normal. Mauritania, in 1981, became the last country in the world to abolish slavery. There was no punishment for slave owners until 2007. The UN says 10 to 20% of Mauritanians live in slavery today. We traveled to the country on the western fringe of the Sahara to see for ourselves. We would meet people who never knew freedom, people who escaped to find their lives hadn't changed, and abolitionists who have been fighting against slavery for years with minimal results. We weren't allowed to be reporting on slavery. It's a practice the government tries to hide from outsiders. But as we would find, slavery is everywhere in Mauritania, if you know where to look.
Je ne peux pas aller chez Moulkher. Ce n'est pas possible et ce n'est pas aussi très adroit. Parce que une fois, on a amené des gens, on a amené là-bas des journalistes et la police est venue les prendre et a pris leur caméra.
We asked Boubacar Messaoud, the head of an abolitionist group called SOS Slaves, to introduce us to people who had recently escaped from slavery. One woman we met is trying to bring her case to court. The government is keeping a close eye on her to stop her from telling her story.
يبطنا مسرحنا بايقة من الحيوان البقار والغنم والبن وظلوا السراحة ما من نجي نعود مطيشين شي من البيضة شي تريب يخبط فوقنا التعمار ويبطنا البط الشديد وباني بنا كاملين شاكين كان يبطني بعد يبطوني كاملين يبطونا بالعمد وبالدبابيس وندوروا فيهم حقنا كاملة وظن كتركة لا تركتهم ولا مخالدين لا تركتهم لكن مخالدين هذيك الساعة معاهم ما نعرف شيء ساعتين معاهم ما نعرف شيء لا عن ماما هدي بس لين عاد يبطوني بطن متين وكل شيء عاد يعطوا عن ماما هدي كانوا ما يبطوني للبطن متين لا هذا عاد معي خاسر لين خلي قتلوه هذا الراجل كنا يسامع عربنا كتبوا بالحالة شنو لين عاد كيف لكن هاي نخلي بيبي هاي مسوي قروة عاد يهزوني فيه يقتلوا يخلي بيبي يقتلوه.
While SOS Slaves was able to reunite Mulher with her children, others are forced to leave their families behind.
مثلا لا نحاول سفن قد كان قد نمشي بها سيفة عود ضامن ما اللي جاتني وتل السناطرة أنا ما مشيت معكم انتم اللي ضمنتوني ما تردوني ضرب منين تدوا لهم طردين ولا اللي تردوني أنا أختاركم تخبطوني بعمارة وتردموني عن نرجع نتخمم بها بعد اللي ما قدنا ساعة اللي مزارع اخوتي لي ما قدنا ساعة ما قدنا ساعة حد مولي اذا كان من الاعدام ما يقدر ساعة
Where is the UN? instead of the United Nations coming out and speaking out against this act, they ban this truth from Europe and nations that have signed on to the global court, calling this hate speech. Is it hate speech or a good old-fashioned truth they don't want told? Funny how hate speech works out to be a political agenda of silencing the opposition. I would consider it hate speech to turn it around and lie and say the Christians caused slavery and continue on to pander to Islam. We know this. We always hear that history repeats itself if they're not told the truth. And you see the History Channel and other lamestream media telling the American public what's happened in the past. They just didn't tell them why it happened. You have to bring the full story to the forefront. Not just history as it was, but why certain things took place. Case in point, the slave trade. Was it really psychotically greedy Christians who twisted Bible scriptures and claimed that slavery was now acceptable in the eyes of God and wow, they can make money? Or was it standard Sharia law under Islam to allow the slavery of any non-Muslim? And an ongoing hatred towards Africans and the darker skinned. It doesn't do the world a favor to tell history from a viewpoint that is inaccurate, because again, it will repeat itself. We must come forward with the truth in love. Why hasn't the UN attempted to change the forced slavery of the Africans? Why hasn't the liberal Democrat media in the United States spoke up? Why hasn't the Democratic Party been confronted with making lying stereotypes of racism against anyone who dares tell the truth about Islam? How funny that is. If you take the scenario and consider that the worst racism coming from Islam and in Islamic nations, and then dare accuse someone of racism if they speak against Islam, that's akin to saying anybody exposing the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in America must they themselves be racist. Go accuse the person that's exposing the racism of racism. Is the mentality. Vast ignorance out of the Democratic Party, and that has flooded Europe. What would this lead to in the future? We see Islamization coming. The average Islamic immigrant was seen to have 4 wives and 22 to 50 children on average. Compared to the West, the average European or American, as the Islamic men themselves said, they have 1 child and a dog, not 22 to 50 children each. And in Islam, where abortion is seen as a horrible sin, unlike Christianity, who also sees it as a sin but yet allows it. They're not aborting their children, and they're going to outnumber us. And again, this is not about race. I guess unless you're an African American, a Christian, a Buddhist, a Hindu, and you end up at the brunt end of an Islamic slave trader after the Islamization happens. They said themselves they were going to, quote, outbreed us. Outbreed all non-Muslims. Straight across the board. America has the Hispanic immigrants to thank for their population not going down drastically. And that 2007 baby boom generation. America needs to continue having children and teaching them the Bible and about Jesus Christ. And why it is that we stand against Islam, from the bigamy, more than one wife, or sexism, not allowing women to drive cars, have jobs, show their hair in public, or show their hands in public. A complete lack of freedom, where women in essence are slaves. And they actually also own sex slaves. Teaching our children the truth, why it is that we believe in biblical moral principles, what the scriptures say about this issue. Leading me to my next statement. Concerning race, we know Galatians 3, there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor bond. We're all one in Jesus Christ. Not true in Islam. And remembering, when they bring up scriptures from the King James Bible's Old Testament on slavery, you must consider that they were discussing working off debts. It was a debtor's prison. There were no debtor's prisons in the desert 6,000 years ago. When one took out a loan from another individual, they made the agreement if they could not pay the money back, that they would work it off as a slave. This is not the same as the slavery that the United States saw, nor that you see in the Islamic nations, which is just as harsh as what went on in the United States, if not worse. In the United States, at least they weren't openly sex slaves. Under Sharia law, they're allowed to be taken as a sex slave. So really, the conditions are that much more harsh. We know that the rapes went on in the slavery here in the United States, and no one is hiding what happened, nor apologizing for it. But imagine a whole nation of people who finds this acceptable to the point that they openly sell young girls as sex slaves. And go ahead and pass laws that if they impregnate them, they don't have to claim that child as a child of their own. And the child is also a slave, if they so choose to make it one. Again, will we allow more revisionist history, or are we going to stand up to the Democrats and stand up to the leftists who just want to discredit the Bible and Christianity by changing history around to sound in such a way that it furthers their political agenda? They've even accused Adolf Hitler of having been Christian. Noting all the textbooks talked about Adolf Hitler and his occultism, the New Age movement, Theosophy, and then his conversion into Islam, which he discussed in Mein Kampf. Current history books have left out that Adolf Hitler left the New Age movement and Theosophy, converting into Islam, as he discussed in Mein Kampf. Had our nation's history books told the truth about Hitler converting into Islam, they would have known the racism that has permeated the Islamic culture. But instead, revisionist history has taken its place. His imam, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, that became the father of modern jihad, who ran a third of his military regiments, 13th Waffen-SS Mountain Brigade, who ran the concentration camps, Islamic, Muslim, Nazi regiments. The Democrats don't want this in your history book. Neither do the leftists and socialists in Europe. And dare to call this truth hate speech and accuse you of the racism if you bring it up. Who's really on the wrong side of history and who's telling the truth? Truth is a hard thing to come by these days. As the scripture says, it's like gold. It's as precious as golden nuggets. Hang on to that truth, teach it to your children, and fight the government when they try to censor it. It's your children's future and their children's future, not just yours. This has been another End Times Prophecy News Update. Carrie Geren Scoggins. Thank you for listening.